international solidarity in action. Now, to place this panel in a bit of a context, in May 2013, a project titled Global Dialogue on the Future of Iran was launched at the University of Toronto in the form of an inaugural two-day conference hosted by the Munn Center for Global Affairs, and the first of a number of initiatives. This project was sponsored entirely by the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade Canada with $250,000 in public money. Dubbed an attempt at a digital direct diplomacy, the conference was depicted as providing an alternate platform for Iranian human rights activists and dissidents abroad. Yet, an event sandwiched between an opening speech by Foreign Affairs Minister John Baird and closing remarks by Defense Minister Peter MacKay, and limited to invitation-only attendance from the Iranian community, it quickly became apparent that this closed-door event served as a different kind of platform. Rather than a space that genuinely hosts the diversity of the broad-based dissident voices in the Iranian community in Toronto and abroad, the conference functioned as a consultation session among the Foreign Affairs and Defense Ministries and select voices in the Iranian community. One of the main reasons for today's gathering and for its organization is to propose an alternative perspective to these right-wing initiatives in the city, whose proposed politics of solidarity with the Iranian people function within a framework of increased militarism, economic isolation, and neoliberal policymaking. The purpose of this final panel is, I would say, twofold. The first is to work within a general theme of the conference that looks at solidarity initiatives around Iran. Here, some of our panelists will look at the ways in which Iranian activists ought to build up their networks of solidarity, and at the question of the level and capacity of the political engagement of the Iranian diaspora. The second and perhaps broader aim of this panel discussion is to then place this international solidarity within our current and present context of settler colonialism in Canada. And here we'll discuss Canadian complicity in spreading injustice both in Canada and abroad, and question what that then means for the kind of future that they envision for countries like Iran. Now, before I begin to introduce our panelists, I think it's important to acknowledge that we are on Indigenous land, and to recognize the resilience, strength, and capacities of Aboriginal peoples as keepers of this land. And with this in mind, I'd like to get started by introducing all of the panelists in the order that they will speak. Our first speaker is Wanda Whitebird, who's a member of the Bear Clan and the Micmac Nation from Afton, Nova Scotia. She's a traditional counselor and works in the field of HIV/AIDS education for Aboriginal people. She has led sweats for the incarcerated men and women since the 1970s. Her group, No More Silence, aims to develop an international network to support the work being done by academics, activists, researchers, agencies, and communities to stop the murders and disappearances of Indigenous women. Our second speaker will be Sakura Saunders. Sakura is a founding member of the Mining Injustice Solidarity Network, an organizer with protestbarrack.net, an all-volunteer online network of groups researching and organizing around mining issues, particularly involving barrack gold. Sakura came to Protest Barrack as an independent journalist and activist whose radio/TV work has appeared on Democracy Now! And Sprouts Radio, and whose writing is published regularly on corpwatch.org and the Dominion paper in Canada. Then we have Sardar Sadi. Sardar is a researcher and grassroots activist based in Toronto. He's been an organizer with Opirg Toronto, Opirg York, and known as Illegal Toronto since he came to Canada. Sardar has also been active in the Kurdish movement in Iran and Turkey. His research mainly focuses on the Kurdish self-determination movement, neoliberal developments in the Middle East, the welfare state, and alternative social assistance programs. And his most recent research is on the Diyarbakir municipality's social assistance programs. And our final speaker is Hussam, who's a writer and community organizer in Toronto alongside migrant and undocumented communities fighting against detentions and deportations. He's been part of struggles against indefinite immigration detention, the campaign to make Toronto a sanctuary city, to defend Toronto city services against cuts, and more. Husan is also an anti-colonial organizer supporting indigenous land defenders across Turtle Island. So each of our speakers will speak for 15 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have enough time for a question and answer period at the end. And
all right. Well, bonjour. My name is Dancing Star. I come from the Bear Clan. I'm a member of the Mi'kmaq First Nation, and the territory I come from is a little place called Button Deck, which is about 19 miles outside of Antigonish, Nova Scotia. So when we introduce ourselves from where we're from, our nation, our clan, and that's to let our ancestors know that are around us that we cannot see and who we are. As she stated, we are on the Mississaugas of New Credit territory. And so when we gather, we always acknowledge the ancestors of the territories that we're in. Now I have to be honest with you, I didn't know I was going to be doing this until poor Audrey is not feeling well. And I just left a meeting on prison needle exchange at Ryerson for the last 3 days. So kind of like, all right, what is it? Murdered and missing women, let's switch gears, right? The sad thing that I say is that as Aboriginal women in this country, we're a target. We are, since the 1980, there are well over 800 missing and murdered women in this country that nobody wants to look for. Nobody wants to even acknowledge that that's happening to our women. They either say when the women who are in the sex trade or, wherever, that they left because of, they ran away. But yet nobody knows where they are. They left their children, their family, and that's not true. That doesn't happen. In many of the families that I've met, there's one named Dawn who I met her parents, and she had a young daughter named Four, and she didn't come home one day from school. She was a university student in Saskatoon. And when her parents called the police, they said, oh, well, she's just tired of being a student and a wife, and so she just left. And I mean, anyone who's a mother knows you're not going to leave your 4-year-old child, right? But they began to look for her, and as people came in and said that they spotted her, one of the things was that they had seen her in Niagara Falls, and so they wanted to go to Niagara Falls to the casino to see if they could find her. I tried to talk them out of that because you know what the casino was like. I mean, they're in and out, and that's probably not even true, but of course, being parents, we didn't talk them out of it, and we arranged for them to come to Ontario. And within a year, so nothing happened. I mean, they refused to put out a missing persons report and all of those things, and 1 year later, a man moved out of a trailer which was a block away from her house. And when they went to search his property, they found her body that had been there from the day after she went missing. Her car was found 1 block from her home. And yet they still said she ran away. And I mean, that's not uncommon across this country. If you look on Facebook, and what we're trying to do is to bring attention to the fact that it's happening every day. Every day on my Facebook feed, I have 1 young woman, if not 2, who are missing from their communities across this country. And nothing is said or done. In Thunder Bay, the phenomena is that when we're in the northern parts of Ontario, we're in flying reserves, which means there are no roads out of the woods, that we have to come out by air. And so when our children reach to high school age, that there's no high school. So we need to fly them out as well as to house them in the cities that are in the south. And in Thunder Bay, we've lost 8 young men, and they say it's suicide in Thunder Bay in the last 3 years. And they refuse to do an inquest to find out why exactly that's happening to our young people in Thunder Bay. And so in this country, when our visitors came to these lands many, many moons ago, when we said Christopher Columbus got lost and did not discover anything but was saved by a group of people on these territories. And we always say that he's the first drunk because, he didn't know where he was going, he didn't know how he was going to get home, and he borrowed the money from a woman to do it. And so You know, they still insist upon celebrating Columbus Day in the United States, which we don't celebrate. And this, I mean, why are you going to celebrate someone who was a rapist and just a dirty man? You know, they didn't discover anyone, and so we've been fighting for recognition and for our own rights in this country since they got here. You know, I mean, we have a history of colonization, oppression, genocide. You know, residential school was a time when they scooped all of our children and made us go to school. We went to school when we were 5 and we weren't brought home until we were 16 if we made it home at all. And I mean, it was law. The RCMP were the ones that used to come and get us and take us. Some of us got hid in the woods. We didn't get to go to residential school, so they were saved. So our traditions and languages were saved. Because when you went to residential school, they beat the language out of you, they cut your hair. I mean, you know, we grow our hair long for reasons that, you know, are cultural and spiritual. And as soon as we reach residential school, they cut both the men and the women's hair, you know, and changed their clothes. So it was an attempt to assimilate us into a society that we didn't, you know, we didn't belong in. We have a society, we have a culture, a language, a social network that is ours, you know. And when that didn't work, you know, and they closed the last one in '96, they came up with what they called the 6-piece scoop, which means that the Children's Aid Society of this country scooped our children because they felt that our ways of raising children weren't the right way, and that they placed them in care. And we know now, as today in the studies, that many of our children who are in the residential schools and many of our people in the 6-piece scoop are now in the prisons in this country. You know, in that meeting that I was just at, the most appalling stats came out that in the last 10 years since the closing of the only federal prison in Kingston and then creating prisons all across this country, Aboriginal women's increase in the last 10 years in prison is 83%. And nobody gives a shit. Okay, 83%? Nothing is 83%, you know? And I'm like, oh my God, so 83% more of our women have been incarcerated in the last 10 years in federal prisons across this country, which we know are incubators for HIV and Hep C, you know, and all of the things that scare us in the night. So we fight against that. Our No More Silence Coalition is a group of allies and women who got together 9 years ago to do ceremony outside of police headquarters on February the 14th. And we picked that day because that's the group that the women in Vancouver on the east side have decided to celebrate their day. So we chose that date. And every year we meet downtown in front of the police headquarters and we do ceremony. We don't say it's a rally. We don't say it's a march or a vigil. We say it's ceremony. It's a time to get together that, one, we remember those that are gone. We remember the families of those who have murdered and missing women and all of the things that happen with them. And most importantly, we pray for our women to keep safe. You know, that our women do not continue to disappear. That my daughter and my granddaughter are not going to disappear in the next 10 years, you know. And I mean that we're not raising warriors to be sent off to war as well as daughters to be sent off to be tortured and raped. I mean, that's what they don't want to hear in this country. Last year, Christmas time, I was on holidays, but anyway, when I got back, a young woman in Thunder Bay was raped because she was a native by three non-native men, or 3 white men, who actually told her, the reason why we're raping you is because you're a native woman and you can. And the truth of the matter is, nothing's been done. So they did. You know, she's lost her children to the Children's Aid Society because of her pain of being tortured in the sense that she is. So her 3 sons are now in care. And she's on the streets of Thunder Bay, and those men are nowhere you know, happy in their lives somewhere. No, that's the reality that we deal with almost every day. In Toronto, since last year, we've had 3 young women die violently in our city, and it never made the news. You know, one they said was a suicide. One was a tragic accident, a violent tragic accident. And the third was a murder in my neighborhood in the Queens Quay down south of here. Bella fell from the 31st floor of an apartment building just after she graduated from Humber College. She went out to party in the King Street district, which we say is the upper echelons of party, and it's not, you know, it's, you know, it's a pretty snazzy place to go, right, you know. And yet, when she graduated and she went back to a party at this condo building, and they found her at about 4 o'clock in the morning, 30 stories below, on someone else's balcony. And the people in the condo on the 31st floor never reported her missing until 12 hours later. Yeah. And so when the family was notified, how they learned of who she was when they called, they found her phone. And when her roommate's been calling her phone for 24 hours trying to find Bella, the police answered that and said to her that she, you know, told her that Bella was dead, blah, blah, blah. I mean, with no sympathy. Went by her house, picked her up, and one of the men that Bella was dating picked him up and harassed them until they wanted them to say that she was a suicidal young woman and didn't have anything to live for, which wasn't true. But yet, they spent 3 to 4 hours in custody being asked those questions so that they could deem her death a suicide. Just recently, because of pressure from the Aboriginal People's Television Network, some information got out in the newspaper, and that was the first time the family had got anything since last July. We didn't even have the suite number, so it's 3109, but we didn't even have that up until someone had investigated that. And I got 5 minutes, okay, cool. And so, you know, it's discovered that what they've said to the family, and I've met with mom and dad, and you know, is that everybody in that house got lawyered up, so there's nothing we can do. Like, yeah, if that was a Native person, that would not be true. Whether I had a lawyer or not, I would be incarcerated right now as you investigated a suspicious death in my house. And so, you know, as of right now, no one's been charged with her death, whether it be suspicious or accidental, and they're still saying suicidal, and we're saying, no, that's not happened. How does someone disappear from an apartment on the balcony on the 31st floor and not get missed for 12 hours later by the people in the apartment? I mean, you know, that just speaks to that, you know, they just, out of that, we have an Aboriginal advisory committee to the police, or whatever you want to call them. It's just a bunch of people who are brown skinned who go sit around the police station. And I say that, you know, because that's true. Anyway, so, because they don't, anyway. They played the 911 tape for Cheyenne for this advisory group to be able to come back to us in the community. So they would come back to us in the community and tell us not to protest that it wasn't a suicide. So they already put the evidence on the table to the Aboriginal people to stop the Aboriginal people from saying that we don't know if it was a suicide, but that young woman had chose to work in the sex trade, and for whatever reason, there's no judgment in that. But that individual's apartment that she was in was someone who paid her for her services. She wasn't at a friend's house. She was employed. And so they still say it was a suicide, and so they still want to convince us that it was her decision. And we're like, well, we just want you to investigate, but they have yet to release the address of that. And so this is not new across the country. It happens to us all the time. So no more silence, February the 14th, 12:30, outside of police headquarters. Come and join us in what we call a strawberry and a water ceremony, because we know that there is only one way to get here, to our mother, the earth, and that's through the womb of woman. You know, and there hasn't been any science that has changed that in all those years of creation. You know, and we sit within this water for 9 months before we're born, and we come here through that eastern doorway, which is woman, and that we must always remember, and we give thanks for this water, as well as those nutrients that come from the earth, and berries are one of the responsibilities of women within our community. And so we celebrate women on that day, on the 14th, and so I ask you to come and celebrate women with us. And I'll answer any questions later or whatever, so thanks. Am I done?
first, I just want to thank Wanda for the stories that you told. I think it really underscores the power in telling the stories of those that are most directly impacted by systemic neglect and abuse. And I don't think that it's any coincidence that, you know, part of what I'm going to talk about, the mining industry, disproportionately targets Native communities. So over 50% of gold mining is on Native land, and over 70% of uranium mining is also taken from Native land. So you can see how communities that are, you know, marginalized in nation states are often targeted for abuse and exploitation. I'm going to actually focus most of my comments today on the monk school and the monk school's role in perpetuating impunity in the mining industry globally and also in other spheres of global affairs. And I'm going to start with a video that I think will really frame what I'm going to say afterwards and really kind of give you an idea of the character of Peter Monk, whom the monk school is named after. So we'll start with the video.
Corporate social responsibility is not something that is done in response to our religion, or in response to NGOs, or in response to recent trends of fashion. It is part of our DNA. Yes, we have hospitals. Yes, we provide clean water. Yes, we provide housing. But much more importantly, by moving into these countries and developing their minds, and most of these countries now are developing countries, we provide, way beyond the importance of money, we provide human dignity. We provide an opportunity for those people to earn their money rather than hold out their hands and depend on charity. And if anything has been proven and has been taught by the global society over the past quarter century, or past half a century, is that if there is choice between creating dependency or a choice of giving them opportunity and dignity, inevitably the second alternative is what produces a long-lasting result. That's where Barrick is so outstanding. That's where Barrick, as a Canadian company with Canadian ethics, with Canadian values, with Canadian morality, has been able to operate throughout the world. And yes, we are attacked. We are attacked continuously, and we are attacked often by a very noisy and very articulate opposition. And while we're pouring in, as Aaron showed you, $4 billion in wages at labor rates which are 4, 5, 6 times higher than prevailing wages, if the prevailing opportunities even arise, while we provide all kinds of community social benefits, and while without exception, the local communities, the local governments, the local structures are dying for Barrick's jobs, for Barrick's investment, and the president of the Dominican Republic, the president of Argentina, the president of Chile. I personally talked to all of them. There wasn't one of them who did not say, please, 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 Barrick, please put out your money into our country. We need foreign direct investments. We need employment opportunities, particularly in those remote regions where the mines are located and no other alternate opportunity exists. So while we offer the dignity, the opportunity, the financial benefit, and ultimately the prosperity and security, we have a group of people opposing us. And please, I'm not here to talk down the many highly qualified, wonderfully socially contributing NGOs, many of whom we are in partnership with. But there is a growing rogue element, an element that wants nothing but stop development. But stopping development is one thing, because you believe in nature, believe in the purity of water. But please, what can they offer to those 20,000 people we employ? What can they compensate them with? When we don't operate, when we don't provide billions in wages, when we don't provide our social services, what is the alternative? To fall back on global aid and charity? This is not a viable alternative. So while we love NGOs and we work with them and we respect them and they made major contributions to improving our world and our children's world, we equally have to stand up for those who are just on principle, are against any kind of development. And instead of working constructively with us to create an improved and better mining operation, an improved and better working conditions, and find solutions that work for both people, a win-win solution, they say, whatever you do, we don't want you. Go away. And what are the people going to do? Line up for social benefits in the remote hills of Tanzania or Peru? There ain't none. So there's no alternative.
There's no alternative.
You must stop me.
Yes.
I do get very emotionally involved. I would be totally irresponsible being the founder of this company and being around now in the gold business for a while if I would not tell you my views about gold. And I always put a caveat especially when I talk in Europe and they ask me about gold. Yes, I work for a gold company, they pay me. So a grain of salt when you're listening to me. They wouldn't pay me if I would say anything bad about gold. So put that into your consideration when you're evaluating my comments.
So that was Peter Monk, the chairman and founder of the world's largest gold mining company, Barrick Gold, and also, in a sense, founder of the Monk School of Global Affairs in a highly irregular process that gives him a lot of power over the program activities of the Monk School, evidence for which I will talk about right now. So I have a PowerPoint, just because I think that things are easier to pay attention to when there's a visual accompanying it. So I'm the editor, organizer with protestbarrack.net. It's an all-volunteer group, global network of community groups, NGOs, all organized against Barrick Gold. So this issue is not just about Barrick Gold. It's, in a sense, a tactic for exposing the fact that mining injustices are extremely systemic in nature. So what we did was we took one company, the world's largest, and we investigated them in like 10 different countries to show that there are systemic abuses related to this industry. Also, Barrick is particularly involved in promoting a voluntary approach to dealing with issues of systemic abuse. And so that's another reason why they deserve to be highlighted. I didn't join this campaign because I was like, oh, Barrick's emblematic, therefore I should target them. In fact, I used to work for a group called corpwatch.org, and in 1 year of working for that company, I just happened to run into 3 representatives of impacted communities. And so by the time I met the third, which was a Western Shoshone in the States, I decided that something had to be done about this company. I had a Google alert showing that Barrick was being protested in all these different countries around the world. So I started cold calling and cold emailing, these grassroots campaigns against this company. And we got together and we did a global day of action in 2007 against Barrick Gold, and we released a report that documented all of these different cases. And I myself have visited barracks mines in Tanzania, PNG, Papua New Guinea, Chile, Argentina, the US, and Australia, where I mentioned earlier, disproportionately, actually in all of those communities outside of Argentina, Native communities are on the front lines of the resistance against this company. So not only are the abuses associated with the mining industry systemic, but there is also systemic denial on behalf of Canada that maintains this industry impunity around the world, while it invasively meddles in the politics of other countries, especially regarding the management of natural resources. So that's another thing that we have to understand about Canada, is that not only are the diplomats and just the entire mechanism of Canada upholding this impunity and ensuring that there are no laws in Canada to prevent the human rights abuses of their mining companies abroad, but also they actively meddle in the policies of other countries, which is probably of interest to people thinking about what the role the monks will play in Iran with respect to the management of natural resources. Sorry, I'm repeating things that I think are important to emphasize. So next, and just to note that my website contains almost 1,000 articles sorted into issue area and country area of barracuing bad things around the world. So there's a large amount of evidence. This is an interesting quote, as if that video that we watched wasn't character enough for Mr. Monk. Here's one where he's talking about how much he loves Pinochet. So I'll give you guys just a chance to read that.
Can you read it out loud?
Sure. It's hard for me to turn around, so let's see. I have that right here. So what you saw in the video was a shareholders meeting in 2010. This was a shareholders meeting in 1996, where Peter Monk said that he was, praising Pinochet for transforming Chile from a wealth-destroying socialist state to a capital-friendly model that is being copied around the world. Regarding Pinochet's human rights record, Monk said that they can put people in jail. I have no comment on that. I think it may be true. But I think the end justifies the mean because it brought wealth to an enormous number of people. If you ask someone who's in jail, he'll say no, but that's the wonderful thing about our world. We can have the freedom to disagree, in this case with political prisoners. And, which obviously, I'm sure the irony isn't lost on you guys. And of course, Chile being transformed, from this wealth-destroying socialist state, it took the complete destruction of the environment. And one of the campaigns I'm working on in northern Chile is actually trying to save the last unpolluted river of northern Chile, because a lot of this transformation dealt with wholesale. Oh my God, I'm so much out of time. I said I was going to give an extra 5 minutes. Okay, sorry. But they're trying to save the last unpolluted valley of northern Chile because of the destruction wrought by these neoliberal policies to the environment. Next. So something I've been involved with is a campaign called Monk out of U of T, and this deals specifically with the corruption around the Monk School. And I really just want to go over some of the key players in the Monk School to show how the Monk School has played a key role in upholding Canadian impunity around the globe. So the first person I'm going to go over is David Naylor. You can see him in the next slide. So there he is giving a lecture in Convocation Hall. We did a little Monk out of U of T banner drop. And this was a number of years ago we did this, in 2000, it might have been 2010 that we did this. And the reason that we did this was because Naylor played a huge role in approving the Monk contract in a very secretive process that actually went over the head of the governing council. And for those that are involved in student politics here, you know that the governing council is no progressive institution itself. It has 50% corporate membership. And so the fact that the approval of the Monk contract had to be so secretive that it couldn't even include them says a lot about this contract that basically gave away control of the Monk School in many ways. So the reason it was irregular, I'll go over into some details, is because basically the chair informed, I'll read this. It's on the most recent article on monk@uoft.wordpress.com. But at a Governing Council orientation session on September 10th, 2009, the chair informed governors that the first council meeting scheduled for October 22nd, 2009 would be canceled due to insufficient items on the agenda. This cancellation was invalid according to the council's own bylaw number 2 because it had been decided on by an online ballot. And it was also highly irregular, given that this was the first cycle of meetings of the Governing Council that had been canceled in over 10 years. So they canceled this meeting. It's the first time in 10 years that they've done this. And the cancellation of this meeting actually allowed for an extension of the summer executive authority. And that allowed a concentration in decision-making powers to the president, the chair, and the vice chair of the Governing Council in consultation with the chairs and vice chairs of the boards. So basically what happened was they canceled this meeting, they concentrated decision-making power, and it was during this time that the Monk contract was given the go-ahead. Many years later, President Naylor, the president of the University of Toronto at the time, who was one of the key players, the small handful of players that oversaw the approval of this Monk contract, well, about a month ago we just learned that Naylor just got signed to the board of, or just got named to the board of directors for Barrick Gold. So, as if you had any doubt that it was a very corrupt process establishing the Monk School, we had our suspicions confirmed. Next slide. So, next major player with the Monk School is this woman, Marquita Evans. And she was actually the founding director of the Monk Center for International Studies. She also happened to be the first CSR counselor, that stands for Corporate Social Responsibility, for the Canadian government. So she was appointed by Harper, basically, to be the person that would mediate conflict between mining companies and mining impacted communities. Her position was criticized as being designed to fail, and 4 years after she was appointed, she just quit very recently. We can see that the critics were in fact correct. Of the 6 cases that she opened during her tenure, 5 were closed with absolutely no resolution. 3 of the cases were closed because the corporation in question decided to walk away from the process. So that was like a big issue with her position as CSR counselor, was that she was not allowed to investigate corporations that did not agree to be investigated. Okay, thank you, 5 minutes. So she was also the founder of the Devonshire Initiative, which was named after Devonshire Place, which was where the Monk Center was located. Mm-hmm. And an important thing about the Devonshire Initiative is that they were founded the same exact month that the Canadian Roundtables on Corporate Social Responsibility released their consensus report. This was a consensus report that was developed by industry folks, like mining companies and the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada, and civil society groups like Mining Watch Canada or the Halifax Initiative. So this was a consensus report that was going to spell a way to move forward to address the systemic abuses of mining companies. Instead, Marquita has a Devonshire Initiative, where there's these other NGOs, development NGOs, who are willing to work with mining companies. So this is developed, as I said, the same month of this consensus report. Harper's government, of course, ignores the consensus report for years, and instead comes out with his own report called Building the Canadian Advantage, a CSR strategy for the international extractive industries. And in Building a Canadian Advantage, he creates the office of the CSR counselor, which he gave to Marquita Evans, and he also spells out a new way forward for CEDA, or the Canadian International Development Agency, to pull money away from human rights organizations that are advocating on behalf of mining impacted communities and giving money to support CSR projects of mining companies. And it's no surprise that when the first CEDA initiative to actually give about $25 million to these CSR projects with mining companies was announced at a Devonshire Initiative CEO gala. So in a sense, you know, the Devonshire Initiative was this parallel institution that was created to undermine the roundtables on social responsibility. Next. So, this is just showing how the 4 pilot projects of CETA were first announced by Bev Oda, who is the, you know, CETA minister at a Devonshire gala. Next. So, this trend has been supported by now Monk School director Janice Stein, who wrote editorials, was quoted endlessly in articles, basically supporting the end of CETA's independence. So for those that don't know anymore at all, CETA no longer exists and has now been folded under the Department of Foreign Affairs, International Trade and Development. And this move was explicitly made to align CETA's, or Canada's aid giving with Canada's trade and other foreign policies. So this means war agenda and trade agenda. And so, you know, this is something that the Monk School, via Janice Stein, is very much supporting. I have a personal story with Janice Stein as well, where she actually went to a Monk at a U of T meeting once. And, you know, she just said she wanted to make the case for the Monk School and defend the Monk School against allegations of Monk at a U of T. And so she made her case, and there was people at the meeting that were wanting to ask her some questions, particularly about the fact that Barrick Gold had sued academics in a SLAP suit, which is a strategic lawsuit against public participation, because of stuff they had said against Barrick Gold. And so one of the people in the audience, at the Monk at a U of T meeting, she was very curious, and she asked Janice Stein about Barrick's role in these SLAP suits. Janice Stein was like, oh, I don't know, and took this woman's email address. And she happened to be the executive director of the University of Toronto Student Union. Next. Within a couple days, Angela received an email and a threatening phone call from Barrick's lawyers, making vague accusations that the Monk at a U of T campaign was making false accusations about Barrick Gold, and they were very concerned that someone that was the executive director of the UTSU would be associating with people at Monk at a U of T campaign. Okay, 2 minutes. Next. So another character that I want to go over is Ignatieff, Michael Ignatieff, who is, you know, a teacher, part-time lecturer within the Monk School, I believe. And within the mining justice community, he's known for not showing up for the vote for Bill C-300. And so this was a private member's bill that was created after Harper ignored the consensus report from the roundtables process to finally give extremely modest, you know, legislation for corporate accountability for mining companies operating abroad. So Ignatieff did not show up for this vote, even though it was a liberal private member bill. So he kind of betrayed his own party in this. And this was a very big deal. This was like the first time any bill of its kind was even close to passing. It lost by 6 votes. But those of us in the mining justice community, weren't super surprised by that, because a couple months before the vote, next slide. Previous slide, sorry. Previous slide. You can see that Ignatieff, a couple months before the Bill C-300 vote, was already being courted by the Monk School, something that he was denied as, what's the word? Baffling. So, of course, those know that the end of the story is that, yes, he did get hired by the Monk School when he completely failed his party on so many different levels. Next. And of course, this conference on Iran is the first questionable conference that the Monk School has promoted. You know, here we have Monk, Ignatieff, and then Vice General Vance, I believe is his name, who was a general during the Afghan War.
Not Lewis Mackenzie.
No, it's Vance for sure. I just forget his title before that. But anyway, so here the monk school is hosting a pro-war conference, having Afghan generals as honored guests. And Ignatieff is there dutifully playing his role as a wartime apologist. He's an author where he wrote several books, including Empire Light, Nation Building in Bosnia, Kosovo, and Afghanistan, where he's actually arguing for Empire Light, arguing that America has a responsibility to create a humanitarian empire through nation building and, if necessary, military force. Another one of his books is The Lesser Evil, Political Ethics in an Age of Terror, where he justifies indefinite detention and coercive interrogations. He stops short of saying, I support torture, but it's basically there in between the lines. And that's another one of his books where he constructs this straw man of the threat of terror, and that justifies any means necessary to stamp it out. And just a note that Janice Stein, I believe it was the last book that she wrote in '95, was Powder Keg in the Middle East, where she argues that Iraq and Iran pose the greatest threat to regional stability. So these are just a few characters of the monk school that I think that you guys should be aware of when thinking about the monk school taking a leading role in framing the debate around Iran. I went slightly over time, so thank you so much for having me today.
This conference, thank Vanda for being here. It was a very last-minute call because Audrey wasn't feeling well. So thank you so much. Vanda's stories and similar stories of the indigenous struggle on this land are the main reasons for us to say that the Canadian government cannot represent the Iranian struggle, cannot be supporting Iranian people's struggle for freedom and justice. I want to come back to this, the monk school, so-called the Global Dialogue on the Future of Iran. Since our first panel, we have been talking about this, initiative. I'll probably repeat some of them, but I'm sure repeating some of these points are very important for us for future to critically challenge these initiatives. Sakura and their amazing campaign showed all the details about monk schools and Barry Gold Corporation, so I'm not going to go further on those details. Protestbarrack.net, I guess there's a website that you can follow up on. So in May 2013, the monk schools of global affairs launched a new initiative called the Global Dialogue on the Future of Iran. It was in partnership with the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade Canada. This conference was a major step by the Canadian government to directly involve in the Iranian politics outside of Iran. The program and the list of the invited people and the level of participation were not publicly known until the day of the conference. Even active Iranian faculty members and students at the University of Toronto were not aware of that, which is completely, I assume, as against the principle of academic transparency. If it was an academic initiative, which I highly doubt it. The event was closed to the public, and while it was called the Global Dialogue, the Iranian participants in attendance were carefully selected and invited. Most of those were familiar faces known in Iranian opposition for their conservative pro-West views. By many who follow the Iranian opposition diaspora, this conference was considered as another step in a series of gatherings in other cities in Europe and in the United States as a political project for the future of Iran in case of a military intervention. We have seen the same political projects and distrust leaders in last years in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and even now in Syria. Therefore, it's not too difficult to understand that the people in these gatherings were all trusted and appointed according to an imperialist agenda for Iran. On the other hand, it was another element of a diplomatic package, including sanctions and the threat of war, for putting pressure on the Iranian government to bring them to the negotiation table on their nuclear program and to include them into the global neoliberal market that David McNally carved at a little bit. And last couple of days, President Rouhani's speech at the World Economic Forum at Davos, he basically said that Iran opens its doors to the global market. And apparently the Mada School and this whole project, they have succeeded so far. We'll see what's going to happen next. We can't predict that. So without going further, the combination of these so-called representatives of Iranian people in diaspora and the Mada Schools conference shows what kind of a future for Iran has been planned. Back to the Mada Schools conference, it's enough to say, as Shourideh mentioned, that the opening statement of the conference was made by John Berg, the Canadian Foreign Affairs Minister, and the closing remarks by Peter MacKay, that time's Canadian Defense Minister and the Court and Justice Minister. In both ministers' speeches and the following remarks by the Mada School Director, Jan Stein, the concept of standing with Iranian people was represented through an obvious neoliberal agenda, as if the ministers were the messenger of human rights and freedom for Iranian people. But what was more interesting, at least for me, it was the constant thank to Canada and the Canadian government and how blessed we are in Canada for what we have. I guess including the Harper's government and these two ministers. Like especially Jan Stein was emphasizing that we really we don't understand that this value of what we have here, and we are taking it for granted. Clearly, it was all of these speeches, they were trying to represent the Canadian conservative government as the emancipator of the Iranian people and having this Canadian model of democracy and freedom for the future of Iran. No doubt, in their image of Canada as a friend of Iranians and emancipator of other nations, there was no place for the history of colonialism on these lands. In no way they would have talked about the violation of indigenous people's rights throughout history, which still continues throughout Canada. Wenda talked about some aspects of this missing and murdered women, and there are so many other aspects of these violations, and the indigenous people's struggle continuing throughout Canada. Neither the Mada School director nor the representatives of the government would tell Iranians about the enormous destruction of the livelihood of millions on the hands of their mining corporations, as Secura showed some of them. Peter MacKay would not possibly mention the records of human violations in Afghanistan. I heard he was called the butcher of Kabul, something.
Butcher of Kabul?
Yeah, Peter MacKay. I don't know. I just heard about that. And they would not tell us about their support for the apartheid regime of Israel, as Mr. Harper clearly states that in many occasions, just came back actually from Israel, that his Canada unconditionally supports the state of Israel. They won't talk about the everyday deportations and exploitations of migrant workers in this country. I'm sure Sam would cover some of that. And about the complicity of the Canadian government in oppressing people around the world. At the same time, the image they tried to portray from Iran in this conference through these false representatives, it was not Iran. Clearly, the reason for most of the speakers to be there was to create a pro-Western image, a pro-Western sense of Iranian people. It was shockingly that one of the speakers in the conference was saying that people on the streets of Iran are supporting the US government and even the state of Israel. All the videos are available online, you can see them. I don't want to go through all of the details of what the speakers talked about, as we are familiar with this fake image of Iranian descent that has been repeatedly shown through the mainstream media. And these so-called representatives are given enough courage to divert the reality of the Iranian people's struggle for justice and freedom. We thought that through giving voice to this particular right-wing tendency in the Iranian opposition, the real voices of the people in Iran, such as workers, women, oppressed ethnic groups, LGBT groups, that we really wanted to have representatives of LGBTQ movement in Iran, but unfortunately didn't happen. These radical student groups and leftist organizations, they all tried to become more marginalized and unheard. Today at this conference, I want to emphasize I'm talking about on my behalf, but I'm sure you're sharing most of these points with all of the organizers at this conference. So here we attempt to prove that the mock schools, Peter McKay, and this agenda is wrong. It's not going to go anywhere. That we are here, and they cannot ignore the real voices of the struggle in Iran that stands in solidarity with the struggles against global capitalism, against Canadian mining corporations, against the apartheid regime of Israel, against imperialist wars and sanctions in Iran and in the region, against separation walls and borders, and against colonialism in Canada and around the world. It's true. Shourideh told about this $250,000 public budget that the government of Canada allocated for this initiative by the mock school. I heard it was $300,000. Anyway, we don't have that budget, and the whole conference was made by very small budgets supported by Ontario Public Interest Research Group at York University and University of Toronto, and Canadian Union of Public Employees, workers. People who believe that these right-wing initiatives do not represent Iranians' work to bring this conference together. We insist on a future for Iran that's not dreamed by Peter Mark, Peter McKay, John Bear, and John Stein and their imperialist alliance in the West. And it's neither going to be written in mock school and Washington-based neocon think tanks. We know the absence of strong international solidarity network with the Iranian people has led this right-wing pro-West politics among Iranians to grow, and there are lessons to learn from them. Shourideh and Nilufar Golkar, they have an article about this the left's politics in Upping the Ante, which is an alternative magazine journal in Toronto. We know that some of the tendencies in left has made mistakes in their anti-imperialist politics, where dictators of the region have been considered as the anti-imperialist heroes, and the resistance against them has been neglected or not supported, as they were feared to serve the imperialist agenda in the region. The same mistakes can be seen today against the happenings in Syria. But with this situation in which the mock school and such places are taking initiatives in their so-called support for freedom and standing with the people, and a critical absence of the left, reviewing our international solidarity politics toward Iran and the region is an urgent task. At the same time, it's a call out to the Iranian diaspora, particularly the Iranian community in Toronto, to get involved in the movements in the city. We are not here to obviously provide prescriptions, and the movement is only built by the people who live in it. The worldwide uprisings in the last couple of years have shown us that the resistance against empire and their regional and national allies are connected to each other. Last summer I was in Istanbul and I participated in a forum in a small park in Istanbul, and it was about solidarity politics. And it was days after a massive repression against the Gaza uprising. And while I was at this park, I saw how these uprisings around the world are very interconnected. I'm coming from the background Kurdish movement in Iran and in Turkey. So we know this solidarity is very precious and important for us. So while I was there, they were talking about how to engage in other movements, how to connect them, and people from Sao Paulo in Brazil and from Cairo in Egypt were connected via Skype in this forum. And one of this is very interesting. There's the Turkish government was using this tear gas canisters manufactured by a Brazilian company. So they were talking to this Brazilian comrades that how to organize a protest there against these companies. So this is a point of how these uprisings, how these movements are very much connected to each other. Okay, I'm just about to finish. So I saw this how people's stories and experiences from this their struggle are similar in many ways, and how important it is to learn from each other. Certainly, this is the only way we can empower our movements and push back the empire. And I believe that we need to bring this to our Iranian community as well, by organizing ourselves and building solidarity networks with other movements happening here and around the world. We need to participate in organizing and building movements here in Toronto along with the indigenous people, workers, students, undocumented people, and other marginalized groups. Most importantly, we must critically challenge such initiatives coming from the Monk School and neocon think tanks, and not to let them to misrepresent the people's struggle in Iran according to the economic and political interests of Western countries. Again, we believe if there is a future for Iran, it will only be written in the streets of Iran by the people who do not separate their struggles from the struggle of their brothers and sisters in Canada and around the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for having me here today, and for all of you for so patiently sitting here all day and participating in the conversations. It's been amazing to see how lively the debate has been. I want to acknowledge that we're on the territories of the Mississaugas of New Credit, lands that have been lived on by the Six Nations and the Algonquin people also. Particularly, I want to thank Wanda for sharing stories with us today, of reminding us of the many deaths that are happening just in this country and in this city. Both Sakura and I were at Bella's memorial just a few years ago. I'm sorry, just about a few months ago now. And it's a reminder of how long that story has been, and it's coming forward. I'm going to speak about solidarity from the place we are in. I'm going to understand and question and pose some questions to us that we can reflect on together on what it means to be in solidarity in Canada and from Canada. So when I speak about what does it mean to be solidarity in Canada, I want to speak to the people here as migrants, as refugees, as displaced people, as people who left their home countries. Likely many of you left Iran as political refugees, as people who could not live there, okay? And then we arrived here in search of dignity, of justice, of safety, of economic prosperity. But in doing so, we have entered a settler colonial state. In doing so, our everyday reality, every step we take, every breath we take, when we turn on the lights, every one of our actions, every one of our integrations, any access to benefits, to services, to the things we enjoy, to the things we provide to our children, come at the cost of Indigenous communities here. They come as a result of the residential school system. They come as a result of the theft of resources. They come at the cost of pipelines that are cutting through the west. They come at the cost of fracking that is happening in the east. They come at the cost of indigenous women who are disappearing from streets and reservations in towns and communities. They come at the cost of children, indigenous children, where, as Wanda reminded us, there was a generation that was stolen and put away in residential schools. There was another generation that was stolen in the 60s school. And now there's a generation that's being stolen away by CAS, okay? And those generations are entering from this, from state care into a prison pipeline. And so when we arrive here and when we live here, it is not possible for us to turn on the lights without talking about hydro dams and mining. And where is those happening? It's not possible for us to go into schooling system, to access healthcare, without talking about the displacement of these communities. So what does it mean to be in solidarity from Canada? Okay? So that's the first question I want to pose here. The second question I want to ask is, what does it mean to be solidarity from here with Iran? So we know that for Canada, the question of Iran and Israel are intrinsically tied. Right? Someone asked in the previous panel why it is that Israel keeps coming up. Just last week, Stephen Harper, the Canadian Prime Minister, was in Israel. And in the Knesset, he made a 45-minute speech. And he mentioned two countries. Afghanistan, where he thanked Israel for providing the weapons the Canadians are using in Afghanistan. And Iran. Okay? And he talked in detail about the Canadian position, the Canadian closure of its embassy in Iran, Canada's continued embargo. Currently, there is a 100% ban on imports and exports. I mean, not 100%, there's, I think 84 exceptions, very small ones, to Iran. And so, in a lot of cases, when we see the Iranian diaspora and the Iranian community talking about solidarity with Iran, it happens with a hearkening to the Canadian state. It's asking the Canadian state to take particular forms of action. Okay. So we talk about, obviously, neoliberal policies. We talk about support in terms of the embargo that's happening, and that's the embassies. But there's another conversation there was another piece I want to add to this conversation. And that's the role of deportations. Over the last 2.5 years, just in the last 2.5 years, there have been 21 public cases of Iranians facing deportation. Okay? These are public cases. So they made the newspaper, there were rallies about it, there were press conferences about it. And all 21 of those deportations were stopped. Okay? Now, as refugee rights and migrant rights activists, that is unheard of. Okay? That's almost impossible. That's an incredibly huge number, right? Because on average, just from the city of Toronto, there are 40 deportations alone, right? Most cases that we go publicly to talk about to stop the deportation, we fail, okay? I can say this here. But for a very particular set of reasons, Canada is positioning itself as the place which is the savior of the Iranians, right? Particularly LGBTQ communities, particularly women. Now, I'll give you an example. In the summer of 2011, myself and a number of people known as Illegal Toronto and others, queer rights organizations, Ryan's here, he was part of it, we organized around a case for a young man named Alvaro Orozco, Nicaraguan refugee who is facing deportation. So a petition was signed, 6,000 people signed this petition, okay? Now a few months later, Jason Kenney, right, Jason Kenney, then Minister for Immigration, current Minister of Jobs and Employment, went and sent an email to all 6,000 of those people, okay? What did he talk about? This is the man who has overseen 81,000 deportations, okay? And he sent this email to these 6,000 people talking about how great the country's record is under immigration and refugees, particularly citing Canada's support for queer refugees from Iran, okay? Why? Because it feeds into a particular Islamophobia. It feeds into a particular role that is seen of Iran and other countries in the Middle East as part of this, grand project that's anti-people, frankly, right? And it allows for the warmongering, the threats, the continuous attacks, the continuous buildup within Canada currently against Iran, yes, and against Muslim communities here. And that, more often than not, in these cases of where refugee determination is being talked about, we see that particular thing actually being pushed forward, right? by Iranian diaspora activists, talking about Canada as this amazing place without any problems, and framing Iran as this absolutely homophobic, racist, sexist, place. Now, so this is the question I want to pose for us, because how do we speak about opposition to the state of the Islamic Republic of Iran, right? Without feeding into Islamophobia here, without allowing for warmongering across the Middle East, right? Right now we're seeing dozens and dozens of Muslim families in Canada either being picked up and deported, picked up and locked away under special provisions called the Section 86 of the Immigration Act. Most people don't even know about this. It's a case that allows the government to throw out people through a series of measures, right? Including denying people work permits, including showing up at their homes, including direct harassment, including sharing information with foreign intelligence agencies, particularly your family members back home, right? So Canada is extremely involved in these particular processes, right? And that's allowed because this wave of Islamophobia is building. And it's building on a particular back of a logic that we are creating, right? So how do we go forward? How do we speak about being in Canada and acting in a way that's in solidarity with indigenous land defenders? How do we speak about Iran and talk about solidarity with the Iranian people, the workers, the LGBTQ communities, the women, the Kurds, the uprisings that are happening there, without necessarily, without immediately falling into this Canadian paradigm, right? The Canadian paradigm that says that this liberal, secular, humanist place is great, that when we oppose the the Islamic Republic of Iran, we're actually mixing it up simultaneously with all Muslims. How do we step back from that? How do we step back? Because we're seeing that attack in our communities. And we need to build these relationships. So those are some questions that I'm hoping we can answer now or some other day. Thank you.